They called us weak, unworthy, but that was before we made them beg. The galactic community had one unspoken rule: never take a primitive species too seriously. Humanity was one such species, fragile, scattered, technologically inferior to the mighty Zelari Empire. When humans finally made their way to the stars, they weren't met with war, nor were they welcomed. They were laughed at. The first human diplomats, standing before the United Galactic Council, were met with smirks, dismissive waves, and barely contained amusement. Their ships were primitive, their weapons outdated. The Zelari, the ruling power of the known galaxy, viewed them as little more than an amusing side note in history. Then, one fateful day, the Zelari made a decision that would haunt them forever. They attacked Earth. Not as an act of war. Not for resources. But for sport. The Empire's rulers, so sure of their dominance, wanted to break humanity's spirit as a show of power. They sent a fleet, one they considered small, to Earth's solar system. 30 warships, each capable of reducing a planet to rubble. The Galactic Council barely took notice. Why would they? Humanity had no hope of survival. The Zelari predicted a swift, humiliating defeat. They were right about one thing. It would be humiliating. But not for the humans. It began with fire raining from the sky. Zelari warships bombarded Earth's defenses, striking orbital stations, military bases, and key infrastructure. Major cities went dark. Communications were disrupted. The world teetered on the brink of collapse. And yet, there was no surrender. Humans did not flee in terror. They did not beg for mercy. Instead, they adapted. The Zelari had seen countless species crumble before their might, but humanity was different. In less than 24 hours, underground resistance movements formed. Nations united overnight. Civilian populations, doctors, engineers, even farmers, took up arms. They did something no other species had dared to attempt. They turned the war into a grind. Zelari soldiers landed, expecting a quick planetary occupation. What they got was hell on Earth. Cities became kill zones. Streets turned into ambush sites. Every building, every ruined structure was a trap waiting to spring. The Zelari, unaccustomed to prolonged ground combat, were horrified. Humans weren't just fighting back. They were learning how to kill their invaders more efficiently with every passing hour. Then came the psychological warfare. The first night, Zelari soldiers vanished. Not in battle. Not in explosions. They simply disappeared. One squad at a time, entire patrols would report in, and minutes later, radio silence. No bodies. No energy signatures. Only eerie, human-made sounds echoing through the ruined streets. Then, the messages started appearing. Bloodied, battered Zelari corpses were displayed in strategic locations, hung upside down, posed in ways that mimicked grotesque warnings. Human soldiers left behind messages scrawled in alien blood. "We are coming. You should have stayed in the stars. Run." The Zelari, for the first time in centuries, felt something they had never known. Fear. A week into the invasion, the Zelari fleet commander sent a simple message to his superiors. "This is no war. This is a nightmare." By then, the humans had already cracked into their encrypted communications. They knew the Zelari's movements before they even happened. They intercepted supply drops, rerouted reinforcements into kill zones, and turned the enemy's own technology against them. Elite Zelari warriors, once proud and unchallenged, began breaking formation in battle. Some even deserted, preferring the shame of retreat over the horror of facing humans in close combat. The Zelari commanders ordered orbital strikes on their own troops, just to prevent humans from capturing and learning more about their technology. It didn't matter. Because humans had already learned. By the second week, the humans were no longer just resisting. They were winning. Captured Zelari ships were reverse-engineered, their advanced weapons turned against their former owners. Crude but effective space defenses were built, making every approach to Earth a gauntlet of destruction. The Zelari had intended to break humanity's spirit. Instead, they created something terrifying, a species that thrived on war. The Empire's High Command watched in growing horror as reports flooded in. Human ground forces are breaking our siege. Orbital losses increasing. It was too late to stop the nightmare they had unleashed. The joke of the galaxy was no longer laughing. And now, it was humanity's turn to strike back. They thought we'd surrender. They thought wrong. Zelari military doctrine was built on one simple principle: overwhelming force. When they invaded a planet, the battle rarely lasted beyond the first few hours. Enemy governments collapsed. Leaders surrendered. The Zelari flag was raised over yet another conquered world. But on Earth, something different happened. Human leaders didn't surrender. Nations didn't crumble. Civilians didn't flee. Instead, humanity organized. By the third week, the Zelari invasion force found itself bogged down in a war that refused to follow any known pattern. Every city they occupied became a battlefield. Every occupied zone turned into a trap. The Zelari commanders were trained for large-scale planetary conquests, sweeping offensives that broke enemy morale before a real fight even began. They were not prepared for a war where the enemy refused to acknowledge defeat. The first major Zelari offensive against human military forces took place in what was once Eastern Europe. Thousands of Zelari troops, supported by war machines, were deployed to crush a pocket of human resistance. They advanced with precision. Their energy cannons tore through buildings. Armored walkers crushed debris underfoot. The Zelari believed it was only a matter of time before the humans were routed. They were wrong. The humans did not fight like other species. Zelari battle doctrine relied on breaking enemy lines and forcing retreats. But humans did not retreat. They fought in layers, one ambush leading into another, one battle bleeding into the next. The first wave of Zelari troops pushed forward, only to be hit by a coordinated human counterattack. But instead of falling back, the humans fought tooth and nail, forcing the invaders into a chaotic brawl where every street was a killing ground. Zelari units became disoriented. Their lines broke. Their orders fell apart. And then came the horror. The Zelari had never encountered an enemy that enjoyed war. Captured alien officers were interrogated, not with threats, but with laughter. Human soldiers mocked them, cracked jokes, even casually discussed the Zelari's weaknesses while standing over their bound forms. Psychological warfare was a concept the Zelari barely understood, but humanity mastered it effortlessly. When the Zelari forces attempted to withdraw, they were met with a new nightmare. The humans had studied their tactics, anticipated their movements, and set up a devastating trap. They had cut off the escape routes. Not only were the Zelari trapped, but their own war machines had been hijacked. Human engineers, despite barely understanding Zelari technology, had figured out enough to override targeting systems. In a moment of sheer horror, Zelari commanders watched as their own walkers turned their weapons on their own troops. For the first time in recorded history, an entire Zelari battalion was erased. By the fourth week of the invasion, the Zelari War Council faced an impossible truth. They were losing. Not in numbers, not in firepower, but in something far worse. They were losing control of the war. What was supposed to be a swift planetary occupation had turned into a nightmare scenario. The humans had not only survived the initial assault, but they were winning battles with stolen weapons, scavenged armor, and sheer force of will. And that's when the Zelari High Command made their worst mistake. They escalated. They ordered an extermination protocol. The Zelari war fleet positioned itself over Earth, preparing for the final phase of their assault. If the humans refused to surrender, then the solution was simple: turn their world to ash. Orbital bombardments were authorized. But as the fleet readied its weapons, something unexpected happened. The Zelari Admiral screen flickered. An intercepted transmission appeared, a live feed from a human base. A captured Zelari officer, bound and bloodied, was being filmed. A human soldier stood beside him, calm and unreadable. "You think you can bomb us into submission," the soldier said, his voice steady. "Go ahead. Burn our cities. Destroy our world. See what happens next." The Zelari commanders watched, confused. Then the camera feed changed. It showed something terrifying. Captured Zelari warships. Stolen Zelari weapons. And human soldiers preparing for a counterattack. "You think we're the ones trapped here," the soldier said. He smiled. "We were just waiting for you to make a mistake." Then the feed cut out. And an entire section of the Zelari fleet exploded. For the first time since the invasion began, the Zelari warships faced something they had never expected: humanity in space combat. Before the invasion, human ships had been considered inferior. Too slow, too underpowered, too outdated. But that was before humans got their hands on Zelari technology. Human engineers had done something insane. They had torn apart captured Zelari ships and rebuilt them. Not to match Zelari design. To surpass it. Now, armed with hybrid warships, part human, part alien, Earth's defenders launched a counteroffensive. And it was devastating. The Zelari fleet, expecting a one-sided slaughter, found itself under siege. Ambush tactics. Hit-and-run assaults. The humans knew Zelari weaknesses now, and they exploited every single one. One by one, Zelari warships fell. The once invincible invasion force was now on the defensive. And that's when the most terrifying message in galactic history was broadcast to every Zelari commander in orbit. A simple sentence. "You should have left us alone. You wanted a war. Now you have one." The Zelari fleet, once the unchallenged terror of the galaxy, was now a fleet in retreat. Not an orderly withdrawal. Not a tactical repositioning. A desperate, chaotic flight for survival. Human warships, hybrid creations of stolen Zelari technology and sheer human ingenuity, pursued them through the void, hunting them like prey. The Zelari had never encountered anything like this. A species that refused to surrender. A species that learned from every battle, growing stronger, faster, deadlier. For centuries, the Zelari had believed themselves to be the galaxy's apex predators. But now they knew the truth. They had been the farmers. And they had just kicked a hornet's nest. The official reports from the Zelari High Command painted a grim picture. 62% of the invasion fleet destroyed, 81% of ground forces lost, 100% of planetary objectives failed. The worst part? Not because they hadn't taken losses. They had. But because the humans didn't broadcast their losses. Zelari intelligence officers desperately tried to decipher intercepted human communications. The few transmissions they could break into were unsettling. "What's the status on the 32nd Battalion? They're holding." The Zelari had outgunned the humans. They had outnumbered them. They had every advantage in technology and firepower. And yet, the humans had outfought them. The Zelari Empire prided itself on never showing weakness. Even now, as their fleets reeled from the devastating counterattack, the Supreme War Council refused to acknowledge defeat. They issued a new order. Destroy Earth at all costs. A second invasion fleet was assembled, twice the size of the first. Every available warship, every battle-hardened commander, every weapon in the Zelari arsenal was mobilized. This was no longer about conquest. This was about erasing a mistake. The humans had made fools of them before the entire galaxy. Now, the Zelari would make an example of Earth. Or so they thought. The second invasion fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system, weapons primed. Their sensors scanned for Earth's defenses. What they found was silence. No distress signals. No panic transmissions. Nothing. Then, without warning, the Zelari fleet's long-range communications cut out. Their command network, once a flawlessly coordinated system, was now useless. Their warships, unable to receive orders, hesitated. That's when the first explosions hit. The humans knew they were coming. And this time, they weren't waiting for the fight to reach Earth. This time, humanity had brought the war to them. The first sign of attack was a sudden power surge in the Zelari flagship's main reactor. For a brief moment, their systems flickered. Shields dropped. And that's when the human warships appeared. No grand fleet. No drawn-out siege. Just surgical strikes. The first human vessel to breach the Zelari formation was unlike anything the enemy had ever seen. Its hull was a patchwork of stolen Zelari plating, its weapons modified beyond recognition. It moved erratically, as if piloted by a madman. And it was fast. Too fast. The first Zelari dreadnought didn't even have time to raise its shields before a human ship rammed into it, detonating inside the command deck. More explosions followed. The humans had hacked the Zelari systems. Using captured enemy technology, human saboteurs had infiltrated the very warships meant to destroy them. They had spent weeks studying their weaknesses, preparing countermeasures. And now, the Zelari were dying by their own weapons. The battle lasted less than an hour. The Zelari had arrived expecting a planetary bombardment. Instead, they found themselves hunted in their own warships. By the time their commanders realized what was happening, it was already too late. The second invasion fleet was destroyed. Not in open battle. Not in glorious combat. But in a calculated, brutal, methodical execution. The few Zelari warships that managed to escape had no illusions. They had lost. And humanity was just getting started. The Zelari survivors fled back to the core worlds, expecting to regroup, to plan for another counterattack. But the war was already over. Not because humanity had defeated them. Because humanity had done something far worse. They had broken them. And the proof came in the form of a single, chilling broadcast. It was transmitted across every galactic network, hijacking communications from one end of the galaxy to the other. A simple image appeared. A ruined Zelari warship, drifting in space. Its hull had been marked, not with energy burns, not with alien symbols, but with a message, scrawled in human lettering. We remember. The broadcast ended. And the galaxy went silent. You thought we were prey. Now you run like hunted animals. When the Zelari High Council received word of the Second Fleet's destruction, they refused to believe it. Entire war fleets did not simply vanish. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. Humanity had not just defended itself. It had counterattacked with ruthless precision. The great Zelari war machine, unstoppable for centuries, had been crippled in mere weeks. For the first time in recorded history, the Zelari Empire was afraid. The Supreme War Council convened in their grand chamber, an ornate Colosseum on Zelari Prime. It was here that the fate of civilizations was decided. Conquered species had begged for mercy on these floors. The galaxy had always bowed before them. But now, the Zelari leaders bickered like panicked children. "They've turned our own weapons against us," one general roared. "They shouldn't even be capable of space combat, yet they outmaneuvered our fleets." "We underestimated them," another admitted. "We assumed they would break. They adapted instead." The High Chancellor, supreme leader of the Zelari, raised a trembling claw. Silence fell. "What are they?" he whispered. No one had an answer. The Zelari had fought countless species before. But humanity was something else. Something worse. News of the Zelari defeat spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, lesser species, ones who had lived in fear of the Zelari, watched. Some whispered in hushed tones, daring to hope. Others merely shook their heads, certain the humans would not survive what was coming next. But then, something terrifying happened. Zelari border colonies started vanishing. Not through conquest. Not through war. Through disappearances. Entire outposts went silent overnight. Patrol ships sent to investigate never returned. Reports spoke of shadowy vessels in the void, appearing without warning, striking without mercy. Humanity had not waited for the Zelari to regroup. They had gone on the offensive. On the isolated world of Velka 4, an entire Zelari garrison of 50,000 troops held control of a vital supply depot. It was a fortress world, designed to withstand sieges for decades. It fell in a single night. The distress signal sent from Velka 4 lasted only 8 seconds. 8 seconds of screaming. When Zelari reinforcements arrived days later, they found the base abandoned. Not destroyed. Not bombed. Just empty. Weapons had been left in their racks. Food trays still sat on mess hall tables. There was no sign of battle. No bodies. Just one thing, scrawled in the dust of the command center. "We see you." It was the same chilling message found on the wreckage of their lost warships. Panic set in. The Zelari were used to domination. They had perfected the art of planetary invasions. Their fleets were unmatched in direct combat. But humans did not fight wars the way others did. They fought like ghosts. They never engaged in open battle unless it was on their terms. They struck in the dead of night, sabotaged supply lines, turned Zelari technology against its own creators. They did not conquer. They hunted. And they were getting better at it. The High Chancellor, once confident in the Empire's supremacy, now found himself surrounded by terrified advisors. "We must surrender," one shouted. "No," another snapped. "We must offer a truce. If we grant them a peace treaty." "Are you fools?" the High Chancellor bellowed. "They are not asking for peace. They are not even asking for war. They are making us disappear." And then, as if the universe itself had chosen that moment to remind them of their mistake, the chamber doors opened. A single Zelari officer staggered inside. His uniform was tattered. His breathing ragged. His wide, alien eyes filled with something none of them had ever seen in a Zelari before. Pure, unfiltered terror. "They..." he gasped. "They let me go." Silence. No one moved. The officer collapsed to his knees, shaking violently. "They captured my unit. Hundreds of us. They took us away." He clutched his head as if trying to erase the memory. "And then, they sent me back. Just me. Do you understand? They wanted me to return." A war-hardened general stepped forward. "Did they give you a message?" The officer nodded slowly. He looked up, eyes hollow. "They said, 'Tell them we're coming.'" The chamber erupted into chaos. Panic spread across the Zelari Empire like a wildfire. Colonies were abandoned. Fleets were recalled to defend the homeworld. But it didn't matter. The humans were already inside their territory. The very strategies the Zelari had used for centuries, fear, subjugation, total control, were now being turned against them. Planetary governors refused to answer hails. Entire garrisons deserted. The empire was crumbling. And humanity hadn't even declared war. They didn't need to. The galaxy had already decided. The Zelari Empire was dead. In the last days before total collapse, the High Chancellor made one last desperate move. He sent a plea to the human leadership. A direct transmission. No demands. No arrogance. Just one question. What do you want? For 3 agonizing days, there was no response. Then, a message arrived. A single word. Justice. And with that, the signal cut out. The Zelari knew, in that moment, that there would be no peace. No surrender. No escape. Because the humans never forgot. And they never forgave. You built an empire on fear. Now feel what it's like to be hunted. Zelari Prime, once the beating heart of an empire that spanned 100 worlds, was now a planet under siege. Not from a massive fleet. Not from orbital bombardments. From something far worse. The humans had never fought this war in the way the Zelari expected. They did not send grand armadas or demand terms. They simply arrived. One colony after another had disappeared, their people gone without a trace. Military outposts had gone silent overnight. Even their vast war fleets, proud armadas that had ruled the stars for centuries, were missing. No wreckage. No distress calls. Just nothing. Now, as the last remnants of the once mighty Zelari fleet patrolled the void around their homeworld, their sensors were filled with phantom readings, blips that vanished the moment they were investigated. Ships drifted without a crew, their systems wiped. Entire battalions of soldiers stationed on orbital platforms were found gone, their weapons left behind. The humans were already here. And no one knew where they would strike next. Admiral Drax stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, the last surviving dreadnought of the Zelari Royal Fleet. His mandibles twitched in barely restrained terror as he watched the chaos unfold. They had scrambled every remaining warship to defend the homeworld. Battleships, cruisers, interceptors, all now formed a desperate cordon around Zelari Prime, waiting for an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Admiral, multiple sensor contacts, Sector 12, a bridge officer cried. Drac turned sharply. The holodisplay showed a cluster of ships emerging from the void. They looked wrong. Zelari ships. Their ships. But they weren't transmitting friendly signals. Impossible, Drac hissed. Those are vessels from the 14th Fleet. They were reported missing a week ago. The comms officer paled. Sir, we're receiving a transmission. Put it through. The speakers crackled. Then a voice, a human voice, filled the bridge. Admiral Drac, we found your fleet. They surrendered. Or rather, what was left of them did. We gave them a choice. Silence. The bridge crew waited, their bodies rigid with fear. They made the wrong one. Then the Eternal Dominion sensors screamed with proximity alerts as the captured Zelari warships powered up weapons and opened fire. The human war doctrine was merciless. They did not fight wars of attrition. They did not conquer. They eradicated threats. the hijacked Zelari warships tore into their former comrades with precision, forcing the remaining defenders to turn their weapons on their own. Amidst the confusion, they arrived. Human warships, small, fast, bristling with stolen Zelari technology, descended upon the fleet like a pack of wolves. They did not fight honorably. They did not exchange warnings or demands. They struck with surgical precision. Every command ship was the first target. Every escape route was cut off. Within minutes, the last defenses of the Zelari crumbled. The Eternal Dominion, flagship of the Empire, was the last to fall. Admiral Drack's final transmission was cut off mid-scream. On the surface of Zelari Prime, the panic had reached its peak. Civilians and soldiers alike crowded the streets of the capital city, watching in horror as their once invincible fleets burned in the night sky. Then, the power failed. Every light in the city flickered, then died. The streets were plunged into darkness. Emergency sirens blared across the city as entire sectors lost communication. The grand palaces of the High Chancellor, once symbols of dominance, were now silent tombs. And then the whispers began. "They're already here. They took the northern garrison without a fight. We should have never attacked them. The humans, they aren't even talking to us." No broadcasts came from the invaders. No demands for surrender. The Zelari were left alone with their fear. Waiting. Wondering when they would be next. Deep within the Grand Palace, the High Chancellor, once ruler of an empire that had stood for 1,000 years, stood alone in his war chamber. His advisors had fled. His generals were dead. His fleet was gone. The humans had never responded to his previous messages. But now, as a last act of desperation, he tried one final time. He activated the emergency diplomatic beacon. To the leaders of the Terran species, he began, his voice trembling. I offer unconditional surrender." Silence. No response. "Please," he whispered. "We were wrong." Still nothing. The seconds stretched into minutes. And then, just as he was about to break down in despair, a response. The screen flickered. A human figure appeared. Their face was shrouded in shadow, but their voice was cold and calm. "Surrender," the human mused. "You don't seem to understand, Chancellor." The figure leaned forward. "You don't get to surrender." The High Chancellor's blood ran cold. "You lost that right the moment you chose to invade us." He tried to speak, but the human continued. "There will be no treaty. No peace. No empire left to rebuild." The feed cut out. And then, the alarms blared. They were inside the palace. No one saw what happened next. No records remained. But when the humans finally left, they left nothing behind. The Zelari homeworld was silent. No distress signals. No activity. No survivors. And across the galaxy, the message was clear. The empire that had once ruled the stars was no more. In its place, only fear remained. And humanity. Humanity had no interest in ruling. They simply left a warning, burned into the ruins of the Zelari palace. Let this be the last lesson. Do not wake the gods. It wasn't just an empire that died that day. It was the illusion of our dominance. We weren't the apex predators of the galaxy. We never were. The broadcast that changed everything. The fall of the Zelari Empire should have been a moment of galactic triumph. To their rivals, it should have been a cause for celebration. But there was no celebration. No victory speeches. No claims of conquest. Because no one knew exactly what happened. All the galaxy saw was the sudden silence. One day, Zelari Prime stood as the heart of a vast empire. The next, it was a dead world. No distress calls. No refugee ships. No bodies. It was as if the planet had simply stopped existing. The only thing that remained was the broadcast. A simple, untraceable message sent across every major network in the galaxy. A single image. The ruins of the Zelari capital. And carved into the blackened stone of the High Chancellor's palace. Let this be the last lesson. Do not wake the gods. No one knew who sent it. No one dared to respond. Because for the first time in recorded history, an empire had been erased. And everyone knew who was responsible. The Galactic Council convened in an emergency session. Representatives from every major species were gathered in hushed, fearful debate. These were beings who had warred with each other for centuries, species that had fought over territory, resources, ideologies. But now? Now they spoke with fear. What do we do? Asked the Varkari diplomat, his reptilian eyes darting nervously. The Zelari were a war race, built to dominate. And yet the humans wiped them out without a sound. We never should have let the humans exist this long, hissed the KRYNN delegate. We should have crushed them when we had the chance. Chance? The Ralven speaker laughed bitterly. What chance? The Zelari had fleets beyond reckoning. What did that get them? Vanished. Humans don't fight wars. They don't negotiate. They hunt. Silence settled over the chamber. The truth was unavoidable. The humans had sent a message to the galaxy. And that message was fear. There was only one eyewitness. Only one who had seen the nightmare unfold and lived. A Zelari warlord named Varak. He had been part of the final defense, stationed on a moon base orbiting Zelari Prime. He had watched the dreadnoughts fall. He had seen the power grid fail. And then he had seen the humans descend. But he did not fight. He ran. And somehow, he survived. Now, he sat alone in a dimly lit room deep within neutral space, shaking, drinking heavily from a flask of fire wine. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. A voice interrupted his trembling thoughts. Tell us what happened. Varak looked up. The figure in front of him was a representative of the Galactic Council, some politician who had never seen war, never smelled the charred flesh of fallen comrades. He laughed bitterly. What happened? He echoed. He leaned forward, eyes filled with something that no Zelari had ever felt before. Terror. I'll tell you what happened. Varak's mandibles twitched as he spoke, his voice hollow. We thought we understood war. We thought we were predators. But the humans, they fight like nothing I've ever seen. He clenched his fists. We prepared for their fleets. But they didn't send fleets. We fortified our cities. But they didn't lay siege. They just arrived. His breathing grew ragged. One by one, our commanders vanished. Our soldiers disappeared. The power grid failed. And then? His voice dropped to a whisper. They came in the dark. The council representative frowned. Came? Who? Soldiers? Varak's eyes widened in disbelief. Soldiers, he spat. You think they sent an army? You think we saw them march through our cities? He leaned in, voice shaking. No. They didn't march. They stalked. The room felt colder. They weren't soldiers. They were hunters. The politician shifted uncomfortably. And what did they do? Varak let out a hollow laugh. They didn't do anything. They let us destroy ourselves. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he finished. We never even saw them. We just vanished. The interview with Varak was never released to the public. But the council members who heard it? They whispered. They warned. They changed their policies immediately. Suddenly, trade routes that passed near human space were recalibrated. Border disputes that once involved human colonies were quietly resolved. Political factions that had once debated invading human territory now advocated diplomatic neutrality. No one dared test the humans. Not after what they did to the Zelari. Not after the warning. And yet, there was still one question left unanswered. For all their fear, for all their paranoia, the galaxy soon realized something strange. After the fall of the Zelari, the humans simply vanished. They did not expand. They did not claim territory. They returned to their worlds and locked them down. Their space became a no-man's land, uncharted, unexplored, and unwelcome to outsiders. No messages were sent. No ambassadors arrived. It was as if humanity had never existed. And in some ways, that was even worse. Because now, every species in the galaxy had to wonder. What were the humans waiting for? And if they ever returned? Would it be as gods? Or as something far worse?